In the dusty streets of southern Puebla, where tin roofs reflect the sun and adobe walls hold generations' secrets, lived Esperanza Morales, a 19-year-old girl with weathered hands and a determined gaze. Every morning, before the sun reached the highest hill, she was already on her feet, helping her grandmother Remedios prepare tamales, moles, and stews that they later sold at the central market. There were no luxuries or time for long sleeps, only work, warmth, and the certainty that in her house no one would eat unless they cooked. From a young age, Esperanza learned that food was more than nourishment. It was a form of resistance, a heritage passed on in silence between ladles and embers. Her world was small, but her inner fire was immense. When she was told she'd been selected for a scholarship at the Puebla Culinary Institute, she didn't believe it. She thought it was a mistake, but it wasn't. She was about to enter one of the most exclusive places in the country, not as a student, but as a cleaning staff member. From the first day, she knew her presence was uncomfortable. Her classmates didn't hide their glances over their shoulders or their jokes disguised as courtesy. "Don't drop the mop in the soup," a student told her on her first day, eliciting peals of laughter that followed her through the hallways. But she ducked her head, picked up the day's leftovers, and secretly watched. She watched how they cut, how they measured, how they presented the dishes as if they were jewels. And every night at home, she reproduced them. Not exactly, but with soul. Remedios's kitchen became a clandestine laboratory. Among old pots and wooden spoons, Esperanza reinvented what she had learned at the Institute. She had no siphons, no foamers, no induction cooktops, but she had fire, she had smoke, and she had memory. She began to jot down combinations, to experiment with flowers she collected in the hills, and to blend modern techniques with flavors that had been in her family for centuries. Her grandmother watched her in silence, without interrupting, letting that passion find its own rhythm. Although she didn't say it out loud, she felt proud. She saw in her granddaughter something she couldn't be, not for lack of talent, but for lack of opportunities. "You didn't come to wait tables," she whispered to her one night as they both ground chilies by hand. "You came to have people sit at your table." If this part touched your heart, please subscribe to the channel so we can continue telling stories like this. At the Institute, an instructor with a firm voice and eyes as dark as strong coffee began to notice something unusual. Chef Isabella Ramirez, famous for her exacting standards and impeccable career in Oaxaca, noticed that certain ingredients were disappearing from the storeroom, not because they were stolen, but because they were transformed. One day, upon entering the main classroom early, she found a small pot on the practice stove. It was a thick, dark sauce with notes of cinnamon, chocolate, and smoke. She tasted it. She closed her eyes. The recipe was from her childhood, from her mother, but with a modern twist. When she asked who had made it, no one answered. Until that same afternoon, she saw Esperanza cleaning a puddle of oil, and without thinking, asked if she knew how to make mole. The young woman lowered her gaze and said, "Yes, ma'am, but the good kind, not the kind from a jar." Isabella didn't smile, but something in her eyes changed. Isabella asked Esperanza to show her how she did it. Not in a professional kitchen, but in her home, with her tools, with her own rules. The young woman hesitated. She thought it was a trap, a practical joke, but seeing the seriousness in the chef's eyes, she agreed. That same afternoon, she took her to her humble home in the Emiliano Zapata neighborhood. Remedios greeted them with a distrustful smile, but as soon as she learned that Isabella was the daughter of Zapotec parents, she relaxed. The two older women understood each other just by looking at each other. For hours, Esperanza cooked with steady hands and inherited steps. She toasted seeds, ground spices, and stirred the broth without looking at the clock. In the end, she presented the mole on a banana leaf, accompanied by rice and handmade tortillas. Isabella tasted it, said nothing, and before leaving she said, "There are competitions where the judges don't know what they're looking for, until they taste it. Days. Later, in a private meeting with the academic committee, Isabella suggested that Esperanza participate in the state competition Flavors of Mexico, reserved for the most advanced students. The reactions were immediate. Some teachers laughed, others were offended. "A cleaning lady representing the school?" they asked. But Isabella didn't back down. "The kitchen doesn't ask for the color of the uniform," she replied in a steely voice. Esperanza, however, wasn't sure. How could she compete against chefs' children, against stainless steel kitchens, and surnames that carried weight? It was Remedios who pushed her. She placed her old mortar and pestle in her hand and said, "This competition isn't for them, it's for you, so you know your talent has no limits." And so, afraid but hungry, not for food but for justice, she accepted. From the moment her participation was announced, the atmosphere at the school grew colder. Stares lingered, words sharper. Esperanza was no longer invisible. She was now the target. Santiago Mendoza, the son of a restaurant owner with influence in the media and politics, led the scorn. He said it was disrespectful for someone like her to set foot in the same kitchen as him. But Esperanza stood firm. She trained in the early morning after cleaning. She prepared different versions of her dish every week, noting mistakes and correcting flavors. Isabella guided her with rigor, but also with care. Each correction was accompanied by a personal story, as if it reflected her own past. In the darkest corners of the school, something big was brewing. A week before the competition, Esperanza arrived at the classroom and found her station in pieces. The molcajete was broken, the ingredients scattered, her notes soaked. No one said anything, no one saw anything, but everyone knew who had done it. That night, she wanted to give up. She came home, locked herself in her room, and cried silently. Remedios said nothing. She just left a wooden box with old utensils, a handwritten recipe book, and a letter on her doorstep. "When you have no strength, use mine. When they don't believe you, cook for them honestly." The next day, Isabella showed up with bags full of ingredients. She had driven hours to get the native corn, the authentic cacao, the local chilies. "You're going to cook as you know how, and I'm going to make sure they listen to you." That was the pact. And Esperanza, for the first time in her life, felt seen. Have you also felt like no one believes in you? Comment below and subscribe so you don't miss out on stories that inspire from the ground up. The day of the competition arrived with an overcast sky, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. The venue was packed, renowned chefs, food critics, students from all over the country. The stations glittered with gleaming equipment, imported ingredients, and uniformed assistants. When Esperanza entered with her denim apron and clay basket, many eyebrows were raised. Santiago, at the neighboring station, let out a mocking laugh. He had brought Italian truffles, foie gras, and a French technique he had practiced abroad. But Esperanza didn't look around. She took out her comal, lit the fire, and began to roast the chiles as Remedios taught her one by one patiently. While some measured exact temperatures with digital thermometers, she measured with her nose and ear. Her cooking wasn't about precision, it was about intuition. The aromas began to change the air in the room. While other dishes smelled of sophistication, Esperanza's smelled of home, of history, of a wet street and a yard with chickens. The jury, made up of respected figures in Mexican cuisine, approached with curiosity. No one expected much, until they saw the final dish, a thick, deep-colored mole served over roasted turkey breast, accompanied by freshly made tortillas and an edible flour salad. There was no exaggerated decoration or Baroque plating, just the truth. When Antonio Delgado, considered the dean of traditional Mexican cuisine, took the first bite, he closed his eyes. The silence was total. "I haven't tasted this in 30 years, he said, his voice breaking. This mole is Mexico." And in that instant, All titles, surnames and diplomas faded into the background. The ovation was swift. First it was a timid applause, then a wave of vigorously clapping hands until the entire audience was on its feet. Esperanza didn't know where to look. Her hands were stained with mole and her eyes filled with unshed tears. Santiago looked down. Her dish, technically impeccable, had been forgotten. The jury deliberated for minutes that seemed like hours, but the decision was unanimous. The winner of the Flavors of Mexico competition is Esperanza Morales. Upon hearing her name, she didn't move. It was Isabella who gently pushed her forward. When she took the stage, she didn't give a speech, didn't mention anyone famous. She simply said, "This mole is my grandmother's, and I only cooked it with her memory." At that moment, even the harshest critics understood that they weren't witnessing a story of overcoming challenges, but a revolution. In the days that followed, Esperanza's life took an unexpected turn. Local media and even national networks wanted to interview her. The school, which had previously hidden her, now held her up as an example of inclusion and talent. They offered her a full scholarship to study professional cooking and invited her to participate in an exchange program in Paris. But Esperanza needed to think. She returned home, to her familiar comal and to the arms of Remedios. There, amid tortillas and advice, she understood that her struggle wasn't just personal, that there were many like her, invisible, talented, hungry for something more. Therefore, when she returned to the school to give her answer, she did so calmly. She accepted the scholarship, but refused to go to France. "I'm staying in Puebla, because this is where I want to sow what they gave me." And that decision, more than any award, was what truly transformed her. Esperanza began her formal studies with a humility that contrasted with her sudden fame. She was recognized in the hallways, but she still greeted the custodians by name and washed her own dishes. Soon she stood out not only for her technique, but for her generosity. She helped classmates who were behind, shared ingredients, and organized impromptu weekend classes for young people. From rural communities who wanted to learn to cook, Isabella, now more than a mentor, became an ally. She found her a small space within the institute, an experimental kitchen where Esperanza could work with traditional recipes without the pressure of grades or set times. There, Remedios's molcajete occupied a central place, like a totem reminding us of where everything came from. The institute also changed. Slowly, but it changed. An inclusion program for underprivileged youth was created. Admissions criteria were revised, and community workshops open to the public were offered. Santiago, who had disappeared for weeks after his defeat, returned one day unexpectedly. He approached Esperanza with his head bowed and a recipe book in his hand. "I didn't come to apologize. I came to learn," he told her. She didn't respond immediately. She looked at him, thought of all the times he humiliated her, and then nodded. "Start by peeling these chilies." From then on, he was one of the first to join the social program she promoted. They cooked together without talking too much, but with respect. Because in the kitchen, as in life, sometimes hands speak louder than words. If this scene made you feel something, don't bottle it up. Subscribe and share this story with someone who needs to hear it. On weekends, Esperanza toured nearby communities with a small group of student volunteers. They cooked in plazas, markets, and schools, using local ingredients and teaching ancestral techniques. At one of those workshops, she met Javier, a young farmer who grew corn varieties forgotten by the industry. They connected from the first conversation. He spoke to the earth, she to the fire. They complemented each other. There was no immediate romance, but rather an alliance that grew stronger between pots and furrows. Together, they began promoting food fairs that united farmers and cooks, restoring value to forgotten products, not just in flavor, but in dignity. Because for Esperanza, cooking wasn't just about feeding. It was about rescuing, reconnecting, and remembering. A year after the competition, the Puebla Culinary Institute organized an event honoring its most distinguished graduates. Esperanza was invited as the keynote speaker. Many expected a technical presentation, others a motivational story. But she took the stage with a pot in her hands and began to prepare a recipe from her childhood life. As she stirred the ingredients, she spoke. "I wasn't taught to cook from books. I was taught with scars on my fingers and with hugs in front of the stove. Here I learned theory, yes, but what brought me here is hunger. Hunger for justice, hunger for a future." There was no standing ovation this time, only a deep silence, the kind that weighs heavily, because each of her words fell like a seed on fertile soil. After that event, she received multiple offers to work in prestigious restaurants, including some abroad. But Esperanza had another plan. With the support of Isabella, Santiago, and other allies from the Institute, she founded her own cooking school on the outskirts of Puebla. She called it Raíz Firme. It was a space built with local materials, adobe walls, clay ovens, and comals on volcanic rock. There, children, young adults, and adults could learn from scratch without needing a recognized last name or a large bank account. The classes were mixed, modern techniques and traditional knowledge, and everyone cooked together without hierarchies. Because, as Remedios said, in the kitchen, we all have something to teach. Thus, Esperanza not only taught recipes, she taught dignity. The community responded enthusiastically. Entire families enrolled in the root firm workshops, and little by little, the place became a meeting point for those who had been invisible their entire lives. Women who had never left their village came, young men who had dropped out of school, and men who thought cooking wasn't their thing. Everyone found a space where their voices mattered. Sometimes, at the end of a class, someone would stay in front of the stove crying, not out of sadness, but from the excitement of finally feeling part of something. Esperanza listened to them, hugged them, and then had them peel onions, because at her school, life was cooked with patience and served with respect. Javier also became an essential part of the project. He provided seasonal ingredients, taught about biodiversity, and helped the students understand that what we eat begins in the earth. One day, after a long day, Esperanza asked him why he'd never left to seek better fortune in the city. "Because my roots are here," he replied. That phrase made her smile. Without planning it, the bond between them grew. It wasn't a story from a movie or a fairy tale. It was real, with silences, with disagreements, with days of absolute exhaustion, but also with unexpected laughter, with complicity, with glances that needed no words. And so, without great promises, one day Javier stayed the night, and the next day too, and without anyone making it official, they were already family. News of Raíz Firme began to spread to other states. Invitations poured in for Esperanza to give lectures at universities, cooking conventions, and even international events. But she always set one condition. She had to bring one of her students along. She said their story was meaningless if it wasn't shared. Thus, young people who had never left their neighborhood ended up speaking before packed auditoriums, showcasing ancient recipes and recounting how a comal changed their lives. One of them, Toño, who previously worked on the street selling sweets, ended up receiving a scholarship to a culinary school in Oaxaca. Another, Marisol, opened her own antojito stand and hired her mother and aunts. Each story was an extension of the original dream, and Esperanza celebrated them all as if they were her own. Despite growing up, she never lost her focus. She continued to cook on Sundays with Remedios, who was now 80 years old and her eyes brighter than ever. She continued to sweep the schoolyard when no one was looking. She continued to smell each chile before using it, because she understood that recognition is fleeting, but the root is eternal. Sometimes, when the pressure was too much, or when nostalgia overtook her, she would walk alone through the market where she grew up. She would greet the same vendors, buy the same ingredients, Once, a boy recognized her and asked for a photo. She bent down, looked him in the eye and asked, "Do you want to cook too?" The boy nodded without speaking, and she simply said, "Then start helping your mom. The best chef I know started that way." Are you moved by this story? Show it, like, comment, and subscribe. That helps us keep the channel going. Over time, stories began to arrive from people who had never met Esperanza, but who had been inspired by her journey. Traditional cooks from Chiapas, Yucatan and Veracruz began organizing food fairs in their communities. Young chefs in training would leave molecular cuisine for a weekend to learn about nixtamalization or ancient fermentation. Television tried to create a program based on her life, but she rejected it. "I'm not a character, I'm a process." Instead, she recorded a series of home videos with her students, in which they shared recipes from their grandmothers and explained how flavor also heals wounds. It was an unexpected success, not because of the technical quality, but because of the honesty they exuded. One afternoon, while preparing tamales for a community celebration, Remedios collapsed in the kitchen. She was taken to the hospital, and although she recovered, the doctors were clear she had to slow down. For Esperanza, it was a hard blow. Remedios had been her pillar, her foundation, her guide. She decided then it was time to write down everything her grandmother had taught her. For weeks, she transcribed recipes, phrases, advice, and even silences. The result was a handmade book titled Fuego de Raíz, which she distributed free of charge to her oldest students. It wasn't an ordinary cookbook. It was a tribute, a way for Remedios to continue teaching, even when her hands could no longer knead the dough. Upon receiving the first copy, her grandmother simply said, "Now I'm not just yours, I'm everyone's." From the book, a new project emerged, the creation of a community culinary archive, Esperanza. And her team began traveling through different regions of the country, recording older women and men who wanted to share their knowledge. These weren't just recipes, but stories. How pozole saved a family during a drought, how a traditional dessert was created in honor of a lost son, how a stew could be an act of resistance. Everything was recorded, digitized, and returned to the communities in print and video format. It was a way to restore the value they always had, even though no one had written it down before. "We are not anyone's voice," Esperanza said. "We just opened the microphone." On one of those visits, in a mountain village in Hidalgo, they met Tomasa, a woman in her late 20s who was still preparing an atole made with 7 types of corn. Her kitchen was a room of beaten earth, with pots hanging from the ceiling and an aroma that seemed to stop time. After tasting the atole, Esperanza remained silent for a long time. Then she said, "This can't be lost." Tomasa, not "You fully understanding the scale of the project," replied, "Take it, but don't forget to come back." And Esperanza returned, not only to that village, but to many others, because she understood that her role wasn't to shine, but to illuminate, and that a star is useless if it doesn't illuminate those who come after it. Over the years, Raíz Firme grew more than anyone imagined, not in size, but in impact. Dozens of former students opened inns, food stalls, rural restaurants, and even mobile kitchens that brought traditional food to marginalized areas. A network of popular cooks was formed, sharing knowledge, ingredients, and techniques without competing with each other. It was an extended family, an unbroken chain. From time to time, they organized get-togethers in Puebla, where they cooked together, danced, laughed, and remembered that it all began with a quiet girl who mopped hallways and dreamed of her comal. At one of those get-togethers, a young man approached her and said, "My mom learned to cook with you on YouTube. Thanks to you, we make a living from it today." Esperanza smiled at him, gave him an embroidered napkin, and continued serving rice. Javier and Esperanza, now more mature, decided to formalize what was already obvious. They didn't have a big wedding or send out invitations. They simply gathered the community, cooked together, and at the end of the day, a child shouted, "You're married now!" and everyone applauded. It was Remedios who tied their hands with an old shawl and said, "This way you won't separate, not even when you argue." The gesture was symbolic but powerful. From then on, they shared not only the project but also life with greater awareness. They learned to pause, to say no when necessary, to prioritize what can't be bought or measured, rest, laughter, silence. Because they understood that to sustain a fire, you don't always have to stoke it. Sometimes you just have to let it breathe. One day, while reviewing registrations for the next series of workshops, Esperanza found a letter with no return address. It was from a young woman named Lydia from Chiapas, who told how she had been rejected by her family when she came out as a lesbian, and how she had found refuge in the kitchen. "When I saw your story, I realized I also had the right to a place. Now I cook for a women's shelter and dream of opening my own space." Esperanza read silently, her eyes moist. That letter wasn't the only one. Messages arrived from Colombia, Peru, Guatemala, people who, without knowing her, felt that her voice also included them. It was then that she understood that her struggle had transcended the borders of Puebla. It was a call that touched hearts wherever roots seek fertile ground to grow. From those letters, a new idea was born: to create a Latin American network of community kitchens, not as a franchise or brand, but as a movement. It would be called Saberes al Fuego, knowledge by fire, and each node would operate autonomously, but sharing values, training, and solidarity. Soon, groups from Argentina, Bolivia, and Ecuador joined. Esperanza didn't direct everything, but she inspired every step. Her role was more symbolic than operational. She became a leader, yes, but she never left the stove. She continued teaching, cooking, peeling chilies, washing pots. She said that the day she stopped doing that, she would no longer be herself. And that's why, even when she spoke at international forums, she always carried a small bag of epazote seeds and a wooden spoon in her purse, in case I have to cook something, even if it's in another language. As time passed, Esperanza's figure began to appear in textbooks, documentaries, and even in murals painted by popular artists. But she never allowed them to use her face without also including Remedios, Isabella, Santiago, Javier, and every student who had passed through her kitchens. "A kitchen isn't made with just one spoon," she repeated. In an interview for an international media outlet, they asked her what she was most proud of. They expected her to talk about awards or recognition, but she replied that no one here feels inferior, that everyone knows they can teach something, and that when they try what we make, they remember their grandmother. The journalist moved, turned off the recorder, and asked for a hug, because sometimes words aren't enough. When Remedios passed away, the entire community came to a standstill. There was no traditional wake. A large collective offering was made, where each person brought a dish that Remedios had taught or inspired them to create. It was a celebration filled with aromas, laughter, tears, and gratitude. In the center of the table, her molcajete occupied the place of honor, surrounded by marigold flowers and embroidered napkins. Esperanza didn't speak much that day. She just sat in front of the comal, lit the fire, and cooked in silence. When the stew was ready, she served it and said, "And today she cooks." No one asked any more questions. Everyone ate with respect, with tears, and with love. And that day, more than ever, it was confirmed that there are lives that, even when they are extinguished, continue to nourish. After Remedios' departure, Esperanza took a brief respite. She didn't leave school, but delegated more. She dedicated herself to walking, visiting former students, and cooking without pressure. Javier accompanied her in this process with patience and wise. A silence. On one of those trips, they arrived at a community in the Mix Mountains where a woman was making ceremonial bread with oak ashes. It was an almost extinct ancestral ritual. They spent a week there, learning, sharing, without phones, without email, without an agenda. Upon returning, Esperanza understood that space had to be made for new voices. She appointed a new director for Raiz Firme and retired, not entirely, but still from the center. "I don't want to be indispensable. I want to be a seed," she said. And like a seed, she continued traveling, sewing, teaching. In every place she visited, she left a handwritten recipe, an embroidered napkin, or an audio-recorded story. Sometimes they were simple things, like a tomato sauce with burnt garlic or a phrase, "When in doubt, cook." To others, she left just a hug and a look, because she had learned that not everyone needed answers. Some just needed company. She never wanted to open more schools or spread her name. Her thing was the roots, not the franchise. Her thing was what grows slowly but steadily, and so, slowly and tirelessly, she became part of the invisible fabric that sustains communities, that web of affection, nourishment and memory that doesn't make the news but changes the world from within. One ordinary morning, Esperanza received an invitation to give a talk at a New York university. She hesitated, not out of fear, but out of common sense. What could she possibly say to young people from another world? But she accepted. She took the stage wearing her usual apron and carrying a cotton bag over her shoulder. She said little. She explained how a molcajete, a mortar and pestle, can be more valuable than an industrial blender, how a slow fire teaches patience, how cooking is also a political act. When she finished, a student approached her in tears. She was the daughter of Mexican immigrants. She said to her, "You reminded me of where I come from, and why that matters." Esperanza hugged her tightly, and in her notebook she wrote, "Today I sewed far away, but I sewed." Upon her return to Puebla, she found the community waiting for her with flowers, music, and stews prepared by her students. It wasn't a tribute, it was a welcome. Esperanza was no longer the same young woman who mopped floors with her head bowed. Now she was a woman with a steady gaze, strong hands, and a generous heart. She stood for a moment in the middle of the courtyard of Raiz Firme, looking at each person with gratitude. Then she went into the kitchen, picked up her wooden spoon, and without saying anything, began to stir a stew that someone had left on the stove. As always, as never before, like her, because she understood that revolutions aren't always made by shouting. Sometimes all it takes is hands that never tire of serving. Over the years, Esperanza's stories began to be told by others. She didn't need to be present for someone to say, "I learned this at Raiz Firme." Her legacy became part of many kitchens, many voices, many tables. In a diner in Guanajuato, a woman taught her granddaughters how to make tortillas like Esperanza's. In a soup kitchen in El Salvador, a photo of her hung next to the phrase, "Where there's fire and desire, there's a future." And in a women's prison in Morelos, a group of inmates cooked a recipe from her channel every Friday as a ritual of inner freedom. She didn't seek out these stories, but they reached her, like letters to the soul, like answers to a question she hadn't asked, but that the world understood. Sometimes, at night, she would go out to her front yard and look up at the starry sky. She thought of Remedios, Isabella, Santiago, Toño, Marisol, Javier, of every name that had crossed her path. She also thought of the little girl she had once been, the one who silently cleaned kitchens, enduring ridicule and dreaming of a Komel of her own. That little girl still lived inside her. That's why, every time she lit the fire, she did so with respect, as if she were calling out to all the women who came before and to all those who would come after, because she understood that the most important thing wasn't to be remembered, but that no one would ever again feel invisible where the soul is cooked. One afternoon during a workshop with teenagers from a public high school, one of the boys asked her if she had ever felt defeated. Esperanza was silent for a few seconds, then replied, "Many times. But every time the world tried to extinguish me, I took refuge in the fire, and the fire never judged me." The boy said nothing more. He just lowered his gaze and continued chopping onions. Days later, he gave her a letter. "Thank you for teaching me that being poor isn't the same as being insignificant. And so, day after day, Esperanza understood that her true prize wasn't the contest trophy or the international accolades. It was every person who left her kitchen believing that their story was also worthwhile. Today, on a shelf in the kitchen at Raíz Firme, next to the clay utensils, rests a small frame with Remedios's photograph. Beside it, a napkin embroidered with firm letters. Here we cook with soul and memory. Esperanza looks at it every morning before lighting the fire. She no longer needs to prove anything to anyone. She chose to stay where it all began because that's where truth flourishes. Her story didn't end on a stage or on a front page. It ended, and at the same time began, with a decision. To never let anyone else be forgotten amidst pots and silence, because where there is cooking, there is root, and where there is root, there will always be hope. And so, as the country continued to change, as new culinary trends came and went, Esperanza's cooking remained, with its embers, her sculpted hands, and her measured voice. She didn't need degrees to teach, or Michelin stars to validate what she did. Her school wasn't an institution, it was a hug, a place where every ingredient had a history and every story deserved to be told. Each generation that passed through Raíz Firme took away more than a recipe. They took away the certainty that what is their own is also valuable, that what is humble can also be powerful. And that, more than any dish, was her legacy. On the last page of her notebook, written in her tight handwriting, was a simple message. If you ever doubt your place in the world, remember this. A grandmother taught me to cook, a broom opened doors for me, and a plate of mole changed my life. That phrase, multiplied in murals, notebooks, and even tattoos, wasn't just a summary, it was a compass. And as long as there was a single lit kitchen anywhere in the world that tasted like dignity, Esperanza Morales would live on. In every spoonful, in every fire, in every root. If you've made it this far, it's because this story moved you. Help us continue sharing, subscribe to the channel, and let more people know about Esperanza.